And now to introduce Evan. So Mr. Evan Yassky is the Executive Director of Facilities Planning and Design and University Architect for UNC Chapel Hill. Evan came to the university in May of 2017, and he oversees the planning, capital budgeting, and project management of all university capital improvement projects and provides leadership to the facility services, design services, interior design, project management, and technology staff. Mr. Yassky's responsibilities have also included steering the new campus master plan, which was approved by the University Board of Trustees in May of 2019. Evan brings 25 years of architectural design and project management expertise to the university. His experience in higher education includes planning and design for numerous large-scale projects, including the renovation of 2 historic residential colleges at Yale University and the design of a new 1 million square foot housing and student life complex at the University of Washington's North Campus. Yaske earned his Master of Architecture from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design and his bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University. He is a member of the American Institute of Architects and is LEED-AP, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design Accredited Professional, Building Design and Construction Certified. So lots of credentials to be given this presentation this afternoon. Take it away, Evan. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jennifer. And now I'm going to share my screen and let me know if for some reason that's not showing up. And also if there's audio issues. But if I don't hear from you, I'll assume everything is good from the tech side. So welcome everyone. I'm sorry that I can't see you all out there in the ether, but I'm glad to be with you today virtually and talking about our university master plan. So as Jennifer mentioned, we presented this master plan to the Board of Trustees in the spring of 2019, and it was approved. And so we've been kind of working within this master plan for 2 years now. I want to speak a bit about what the master plan is and also what it isn't. Unlike some master plans, including some that have been done at Chapel Hill in the past, it's not a plan of how to spend a pot of money that we have and figure that out. It's more of a framework so that as opportunities come up over time, it is useful for us to have this framework in which to make decisions about how, where, and in sort of what size we're going to be developing the campus from here forward. So clicking to advanced slides, there it is. So there's our agenda today, the introduction, the big ideas of our master plan, the plan itself, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. So I wanted to put up a few images of some buildings that were built or at least well along in design around the time of 1970. And I do this not to really start a conversation or critique of architectural style of that era. There's been lots written and spoken about that, and probably worth another webinar at a later point. But the point here really is to say that these buildings have gotten to a stage at which they need to be thought of as redevelopment opportunities, either for a new building in that place or a major renovation of these buildings. So that really is an important context for this master planning effort that we undertook, which is to say, we're not just looking at where are we going to put the next new building, but what are we going to do with the building stock we have? We have about 400 buildings on our campus, and maintaining them has proven to be a challenge, especially with the amount of funding that we get for renovation from the state. So we have to be very mindful of the assets, the physical assets that we do have, how to best utilize them, and where the best opportunities are for meeting our current and future needs in terms of space. So here's a timeline of how we went about the master planning process. It was really a solid 2 years of work that began with some listening sessions, and the amount of people that participated in this was significant from across campus and different constituencies. We had, of course, senior leadership and trustees that participated. We had faculty, we had staff, we had students participate, we had some alumni that weighed in, and we had many sessions where we heard about what people were thinking, where the greatest needs were, and then we moved into a testing phase that involved creating really scenarios, and it was an iterative process to have our consultant, I should mention, Ayers St. Gross was the master planning consultant that we hired. They had done our last 2 master plans. They've been really a trusted partner at Chapel Hill for decades now, and they have still an excellent team and are considered one of the most prominent master planning firms in the country. So they worked with us to create scenarios, test those with the different constituent stakeholder groups, come back and iterate those over a series of workshops in 2017. And then there was a synthesis period where we took all that information and we began to look at how to create a real plan based on that. You'll see then in the middle part of 2018 through the end of 2018, we were refining that vision and going back out to more conversations with stakeholders to see what was missed, and then kind of finalizing that in the master plan itself. I'm just going to move some things on my desktop here, sorry, so I can see what I'm talking about. So what is a master plan? I spoke a moment ago about what it is and what it isn't in a way. But I think here this diagram really talks to what it's all about at its heart, which is a shared vision for the future. And it's a long-range plan, 10 to 20 years is typical for these campus master plans. And they need to be renewed because things change over the course of time. So either you do an update to a master plan, or if it's been a long time since you've done a full master plan, likely it's time to do a new one because the physical nature of the campus has changed, but also the mission evolves, and what the needs are is sort of constantly changing. So it's a bit of a snapshot in time. And like I said, it's really a framework. It should have some flexibility and allow and support, I should say, decision making. So next slide here. Another really important point to make at this stage, which is the alignment with the strategic framework. So right at the beginning of this process for creating a campus master plan, the chancellor at that time, Carl Folt, was developing a strategic framework, and the two things really need to be talking to one another. It's typically best if the strategic framework has just been put in place, developing then the campus master plan to align with the framework and the strategic initiatives of the institution. So you'll see some things that you would be familiar with if you've seen the blueprint for Next that was created, the pillars of the public for the public, innovation made fundamental. You can see some of those strategic initiatives. Those were deeply meaningful and informative to the master planning process. Out of that, what evolved were 3 big ideas of what the campus needed to do moving forward. And some of this was in response to deficiencies that were identified, and some were about new opportunities that were emerging and how Chapel Hill needed to address those in order to remain and raise our profile as a preeminent research university in this country. So you'll see those big ideas in front of you, and we're going to step through them so you can learn more about those big ideas as we step through this. So the campus today, you're likely familiar with a lot of what it looks like today. It's certainly different than it was in 1970, but at its heart, it's still the same place. It's defined by natural features. You see nearly 4,000 total acres, and obviously not all that land is developable, nor are we interested in developing a significant portion of that land. And access is constrained, so we need to be thinking about how different sites are accessed. The core is very mature. We're obviously the oldest public university in the country, so we need to consider the sensitivity of developing right at the core versus opportunities that may be different in parcels that are further from that core. The third bullet point that you see on this slide about renewal is really one of the critical aspects of this master plan that distinguish it in some ways from master plans that you may have seen before that are done at other institutions, and they focus on that need for renewal. So we're going to have a little bit more slides about this issue, but just pointing out that number there, 6 million gross square feet, which is about 30% of the campus, in buildings that are rated in severe or poor conditions. So we do have some metrics that we use in measuring the condition of our buildings, and we keep that database up on a rolling basis. So the renewal of our campus is really critical and inform this plan. Campus systems are important to think about in terms of how the physical and the strategic interact with one another. So it's not just about buildings, it's about transportation systems and how people move around, both in pedestrian manner and in other ways by vehicles and bicycles, and now things like scooters and other things, way that people get around and move from point to point on what is a large campus. The open space network is important for a number of reasons. It's really, in many ways, the identity of this campus, and the fabric that stitches everything together is the open space. It provides shade, it provides breathing space and enjoyment and outdoor learning opportunities. And then there's the infrastructure that kind of powers everything that happens across campus. We have a vast network of infrastructure to heat, cool, provide power, deal with stormwater and other water issues around campus. So those infrastructure needs need careful consideration. So here's an interesting map I find for this issue of facilities condition. So again, you'll see that number of 6.4 million gross square feet in severe or poor condition. You'll see this term FCI on the slide, Facility Condition Index, and so that's the metric that I was discussing. And so anything that's greater than 0.7, and that really means the amount of money it would take to bring that building up into good condition where all the systems are current and in good shape relative to the cost of replacing that facility entirely. So if there was a condition of 1, an FCI of 1, that would mean it would cost as much to renovate the building as it would to build it from scratch. So it's a healthy list of those that have are above the 0.7. And within that list, you'll see things like down at the bottom there, the Phillips Annex building. So actually, since we've created this document, we've demolished that building and are well along on building a replacement building in its place. So the map really shows you that these buildings in poor condition are sprinkled throughout the campus, but there are a large cluster north of South Road in the historic core of the campus. So it's something that we have to work carefully to understand how to deal with those buildings, many of which have important historic character. This slide then sort of takes a subset of the buildings in poor condition, saying where do we think the greatest opportunities for change are. So the buildings that we feel are the most likely to be demolished in the coming years. Again, some of these have already been demolished, and one that's sort of in the center of the screen, oops, towards the west is Lenoir Hall. I think if you can see my cursor, that is where the educational component for the medical school happens, and that building has recently been demolished, and a replacement building is already underway on that site. Okay, the big ideas. We mentioned these three earlier. Welcome is the first big idea, and then on the right we show which of those elements of the strategic framework directly relate to this big idea. So you can see, once again, the connection and relation of these big ideas to the strategic framework. So what is Welcome really about? It's about, well, welcoming folks to the campus. What does it feel like if you are a first-time visitor, if you're a prospective student, if you are a neighbor who lives in the area around Chapel Hill, to come and experience the campus. So what is that experience like? Is it confusing? Is it welcoming? What more could we do? We're a campus that doesn't necessarily have a clear, identifiable front door. And for a campus of our size, it's not obvious that it really should have a single front door. It's really too large to have the vast majority of people come to the campus from one spot in one direction. And so we think that there are multiple opportunities to create a very Carolina welcome to folks who are coming to our campus. And so this diagram identifies a few particular opportunities. The one at the bottom of the screen, the Campus South Hub, I'll talk about a little later, as a significant redevelopment opportunity. But those that you might be a little more familiar with, including the Undergraduate Admissions office, is a first stop for thousands and thousands of folks every year, many of which is their first time ever on their campus, and so the point of entry and the point of welcome. Another spot at Porthole Alley, just off of Franklin Street, where just pre-pandemic we opened a new visitor center that had been in the Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center building. We opened it right on Franklin Street at the edge of Porthole Alley, and we have some thoughts about how to expand in that area and create a very new and welcoming experience for folks coming to that entry point onto the campus. We thought about and certainly discussed where people are coming from, and people, as you know by now, are coming from a vast array of places to get to our campus, and so we are considering things like regional transit opportunities and the continual set of discussions and conversations around transit. We do have a significant number of folks who come to campus every day that take transit to get here. And so we think that that's an increasingly important part of the future of how the campus is experienced and entered. So with each of these big ideas, we're going to give an example of what one of those, a project that could address that specifically. So for this one, we start with the undergraduate admissions, and at least during the normal times, there's a pretty tried and true route for those who come to admissions and then experience the campus either with a formal tour or with their self-guided tour of the campus. And so much of that tour will pass through this area that's shown on the screen, where there's a lot of surface parking and areas of asphalt that could be cleaned up and made greener. So we said, what could we do about that? And that wouldn't be a terribly expensive thing to do. So a future concept that does include some new buildings on the upper quad area, and the buildings shaded blue or areas for renovation opportunity. So we said, if we were doing something like that, or even prior to, we could create a greener, more welcoming experience for folks that are taking that standard tour route. Connections is the second big idea. As you see the subheading, link it together in those parts of the strategic framework that are directly related. And this I find to be perhaps the most important one in my mind, because it speaks to how the university is going to grow and really fulfill its mission in terms of both learning and research, and the increasing importance of interdisciplinary activities. We've already been seeing that quite a bit on the research side. It seems to be growing every year. So the ability for our students, our faculty, and our staff to be able to connect with one another in productive ways with as little friction to those types of connections as possible is going to be increasingly important to the success of the university and to those that study and work here. So those connections happen in a multitude of ways. And we thought about the networks that exist across campus in a physical way, and how we could further support that. So you can see those elements of a strong connection listed, and where are there pain points? Where is it hard to get from one place to another? Where is it not a great experience, so it doesn't invite people to connect along certain corridors? So here's the example project that we gave for this big idea, and we call it the Paul Hardin Drive Extension. Right now, in the southern half of campus, the east-west connections are not as strong as they could be. So, you know, those folks who are on the west side in the health affairs concentrated area on South Columbia Street, trying to get through towards the eastern, or vice versa. You know, on the east side, there's a variety of other amenities and buildings, housing buildings and athletic facilities, and you cross through the back of the hospital complex in a way that's nearly impossible to traverse right now. So we've identified this as a priority for when resources are available to create what could be a wonderful, primarily pedestrian and cycle pathway, probably be open for emergency service vehicles as well. But it would involve a redevelopment of our campus health facility, as well as some older buildings that are currently used by the hospital and med school that have passed their useful life. So we would need to address those needs right now. But to point out, we're actually actively involved on projects at the eastern and western end of this transit or access, I should say, across the campus. On the west side, that medical education building is the replacement for Berryhill Hall. And on the eastern end, where you see a hospital generator and parking garage, there's a project currently underway there that is going to create the first part, sort of this area of extending Paul Hardin Drive, which sort of ends at this parking lot at Morrison Hall, and will extend that drive to this point, anticipating the ability in the future to connect all the way to the medical education building, which is providing a new entry at its eastern end, the western end of the axis, whereas the old Berryhill Hall did not have that amenity. And then the third big idea is hubs. The strategic framework, again, pieces that fit with the hubs concept. And so hubs are really thought of as a locus of activity. And the best example that we have on our campus of a hub right now is the pit area, because there are so many different activities happening and around the pit. It creates a locus of energy, a locus of activity. Again, the idea of connections will tie into this as well, because people can connect more easily when there are those interdisciplinary activities happening. And so to create places that have this variety and this energy is something that we want to enhance in the future. And we've seen this time and again on other campuses that have done this successfully, both older campuses, newer campuses, that inject a new level of energy by not just creating housing areas or athletic or recreational areas or classroom areas, but a mix of those activities. And that has been very dynamic and advanced the life and creativity, I would say, of those campuses. So we sort of looked at this in terms of two different axes or sort of perimeters of the campus. On the western side of campus, where there's opportunities for innovation and convergence, and then on the eastern side, more of a student support that balances out the existing amenities and facilities for student housing and student life already on the eastern side. But the premier hub that we were interested in creating for the future is this South Campus hub. So this is the existing condition, although it's changed slightly with some of these buildings now demolished. But it shows what the southern edge of the main campus looks like with its road network. The dashed yellow lines are opportunities for rationalizing that road network, which are more difficult to navigate today, as well as the array of small buildings that we refer to as the Odom Village. Those smaller residential buildings that were built shortly after World War II were probably not intended to last 60 plus years, but here we are. And so we got funding to demolish what we thought could be all of those buildings that were no longer used. It turns out we couldn't do it with the funding we have, but we've demolished many, just a bit more than half of those buildings today. So all those little buildings that you see in orange are the Odom Village buildings that we are planning on completing the demolition phase in the near future. That'll open up significant redevelopment opportunities. So what you see here is an imagined future state, and whether this is it's not going to be in 5 years, it won't look like this. Will it be in 10 or 20? We're really not sure. There are a lot of factors that go into the creation of a significant amount of new square footage like this. I did want to pause on this slide to point out the magenta line that snakes through there. This represents the light rail that was really envisioned as the next big move in regional transit throughout the time of our master plan. And right around the time that we were set to get approval from the Board of Trustees, this plan essentially died. After years of work and years of study, it was deemed politically infeasible, and there was no way to fund the project, but it was going to connect Chapel Hill to Durham, the downtowns, and create a way for the regional workforce to get around and to get to the main employment centers. So some of this was based on having that ability and having a terminus right here on the southern part of our campus. The fact that that's no longer going to happen, we don't feel is something that invalidates this planning, in part because as soon as the light rail went away, conversation started pretty much immediately on a bus rapid transit as the backup idea, and we think we will have a major stop right where the stop for the light rail is going to be. There'll be a different way to get to it, but still having a transit hub that facilitates all the other activity around it is we think very much part of the future. So, and on this concept for a hub of buildings that will serve a variety of uses, research, housing, academic, and some we think other amenity type of spaces, whether it be dining, recreation, those activities that sort of keep people in the area into the evening and on weekends. We have two projects that are underway in this core area. So the business school, which is currently located over here with its parking deck associated with the business school for Keenan Flagler. We're already well into design on a new building. It doesn't look exactly like this anymore in terms of its footprint, but it is in this location, reaching out from the hilltop that McCall building sits on towards William Blythe Drive, and sort of reaching out to the rest of campus. There's another research building over here on the western side of this area that we started design pre-pandemic, and we put that project on pause, but we've been having conversations in recent weeks to try to restart this project. It's going to be a significant new research building to kind of marry up with the existing research facilities in this neighborhood and create a real research quad. So that's really the master plan, and this is what it looks like when it's all put together. I know I spent essentially the entirety of the conversation talking about what we call main campus, which is, you know, the main parcel, but we have other parcels such as the Mason Farm Tract, which includes the golf course, but a lot of other land there as well, and Carolina North. So I'll mention here, because many will likely remember that Carolina North was the topic of much conversation about 15 years ago or so, and thoughts that there would be additional and significant investment in new facilities up at Carolina North. In the interim, we have done things like shut the airport. So the Horace Williams Airport is officially closed as of about a year and a half ago. And we still maintain the property. However, the interest in a major building campaign at Carolina North has really shifted. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with this idea of collaboration and interaction among different groups and units on campus. And, you know, so everyone wants to be in the core and at the heart. So the idea of going up to Carolina North became less attractive. We still think there are opportunities up at Carolina North, and we hold them, you know, out for the future, perhaps the more distant future. But one thing, for example, that we could do with that property is create more recreational opportunities. It's something we benchmark against peer institutions, and for our students, particularly something like field recreation is in short supply, and that's a place where students could go and have opportunities for more field type of sport recreation. So that's something that we thought about doing up at Carolina North. And I'll close with this slide, which just shows highlighted some current or recent projects. The purple color shows some projects that we've completed in recent years, and those are what we call our central campus athletics plan. That includes the indoor practice facility, a new stadium for soccer and lacrosse, and a new stadium for field hockey. And those were very successful projects, and those teams have actually been incredibly successful since those facilities have opened. So there may be a relationship there. And then the yellow ones are projects that are either in design and planning or already under construction. So the new education building for the medical school is there. We've recently started talking with School of Nursing. We got an appropriation for a project at Lenoir Hall. Also, you'll see in the hospital area right here, though it's not technically a university project, it sits on campus, and there's a very large new building for the hospital to create a surgical tower. So even at this time, the business school building is down on the southern end, you'll see that. So We do have some significant projects that we're currently looking at, but I think a lot that's in the plan will depend on new sources of funding in coming years. Some of that may come out of the current legislative session. We certainly hope that we do get funding for more of the renewal type of projects to take some of our older buildings and do comprehensive renovations to those that will deal both with our deferred maintenance and provide the ability to update the activities and programs that we do in those buildings. So with that, I will pause here and see if we go into a discussion phase. Happy to entertain any questions that you may have.
Great. So thank you, Evan. So as Evan just mentioned, and this is all fascinating, right? All these changes. If you have questions, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the chat box, but down at the bottom of your screen of your Zoom window, there is a box that says chat. If you click on that and you have a question you'd like to ask Evan, feel free to type it into the chat box and then we will field that question to Evan. So please just drop your question in the chat box and we'll ask away.
I see one that just popped up in the Q&A box. Jennifer, should I go from there?
Yep, I think that's perfect.
Okay. So there's a question that says, when is Davis Hall being demolished? I'm guessing that might be about Davy Hall, because essentially whenever I give this presentation or something like it, someone asks about Davy Hall. So we do have Davis Library, which we don't have any plans to be demolished, but Davy Hall, people ask about all the time. So, and Davy has an old original building, and then the addition that was put on, that's the building that is closest to camera, and is actually one of those images that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. So we did a feasibility study maybe 5 to 6 years ago, and it was either going to be a comprehensive renovation or replacement for that building. And it houses the departments of psychology and neuroscience, departments that have been growing in recent years. And so there's certainly an identified need to do something with those programs, as well as the building doesn't serve those programs any well after about 50 years. So I'll detour slightly on this answer to say that in 2017 and into the beginning of 2018, we did a study for a really exciting project that's called the Institute for Convergent Sciences. And it was going to house those programs in Davy, which would allow us to redevelop Davy. We had a site picked out for this institute, and it was the chancellor's, one of the chancellor's top priorities to fund this project because it would really push the ability of interdisciplinary and collaborative research, a big step forward on campus in a facility that could really be tailored to that type of activity. And the issue there is how to fund it. So we've been working in the last 3+ years to identify funding sources. There's still, it still exists as a top priority for the chancellor, and it's about how to find funding for it. So more to come on Davy Hall. Okay, I'm not sure whether to go from the Q&A or chat. I'll just try to go with them as I see them. What are some examples of repurposing old spaces? Well, I would say that the Phillips Annex building is an example of repurposing an older site where we had a building that really was not functioning at all anymore, and we've taken that down and are building a new building for now called Hussman School of Journalism and Media. But we also take older spaces and try to breathe new life into those as well. So an example, even in Davis Library, we've taken some older spaces that might not seem old to some of you because that building wasn't here when you were on campus as students. But we do find those opportunities often. Even a building that I think was built in the 60s in the Student Stores building, we renovate that building frequently in the Student Union as well. We're often finding new uses in those types of buildings for new ways to occupy them. I see my old friend Linda has asked about plans for significant enrollment growth. At the moment, that's not really a driver, or certainly it wasn't when we were going through the master plan. And I think you were participating in some of those conversations. So the plan was not really based on new enrollment growth. Since then, I think that topic has come up a little bit more, and where exactly that is in the process of finding its way through the trustees and the UNC system up to the legislature to get support and funding for more students. I'm not sure. I think if those numbers do come back with any significant increase, we'll probably have to revisit this plan to see how to accommodate a lot more students, because that was not really anticipated when we were doing our planning work. I see a comment or question about Lenoir Hall that popped up. That's an excellent question because it remains, I'd say, the primary dining hall for the undergraduates, at least in the middle part of the day. We do have Chase Dining Hall that is popular in the evening based on its location, but Lenoir sort of, we realized several years ago that it had been outgrown. The number of students that are in there on a daily basis is in excess of what that building can hold. So we've struggled with our campus dining group to figure out how to address that situation, because what it really wants to have is a new building somewhere, but it's extremely difficult to do that without some other type of financial support. In other words, just the revenues generated from the dining operations probably aren't enough to pay off the debt of building a new dining hall. So absent that, we've been talking about smaller interventions to create almost mini places to have lunch, because the lunchtime that is the big difficulty to accommodate the people. So we've done that. We've looked at a few places where we might take some of that load during the midday rush and create some breathing space for Lenoir, but we haven't solved that to a great degree. Let's see. Plans given more distant learning during and after COVID. I do think that distance learning was something that was happening in an increasing way at Chapel Hill pre-pandemic, but obviously the experience of the pandemic has shown that it can be done. I don't think we solved how to do it by a long shot, and we'll sort of see when we come back in September, but I think pretty much everyone I've spoken to feels that the demand for an in-person residential experience is incredibly strong. So I don't see that we're going to be preferencing the distance learning as opposed to the in-person learning in the future. I think it may be more about hybrid solutions, both accommodating those that do want to learn but aren't able to come to campus, and how can we provide a residential experience for them in part, as well as maybe change the mix of how learning happens so that there might be certain experiences that happen online, but the more intensive experiences happen in person. So it's a great question that a lot of people have been talking about recently. And I think, stay tuned on that, because I think there will be some changes in the coming years. Question about a restaurant at Keenan Stadium. I've not heard talk about that. There certainly are plenty of concessions, and then there's hospitality areas that athletics runs for a more sort of limited set of folks that come to enjoy activities at Keenan, but I've not heard of something like a full service restaurant. A question or perhaps comment about students choosing to live off campus, apartments popping up close to campus. What are the plans for dorms that don't have sufficient occupancy? So that's almost a plan in itself, and we did have an offshoot plan that focused exclusively on housing that was kind of done in parallel with this. And so we had a separate consultant working with us in our facilities planning group with Carolina Housing. And we put together, it was about a 12-year plan for how to take a building offline, renovate it, and then bring it back into use so that another one could come off, because as you might imagine, there's a need to limit the amount of those dorm rooms that are offline at any one time. But it was recognized that there was a significant need for renewal of our housing options on campus, both they had just gotten quite old, some of those buildings. I think I remember a statistic that the average age of one of our residential buildings on campus was about 1949. Of course, that includes Old East and Old West, but even if you take those out of the sample, the average age of a dorm is still well over 50 years. So it's about the age of the buildings, but also the changing desires of students. They tend to want to live in more apartment style housing or suite style housing, not the old, double bedrooms off of a corridor with group bathrooms down the hall. That's really not desirable. And so students have sort of voted with their feet, if you will, to seek out those apartment style living options that have developed in the surrounding community. So Carolina Housing has acknowledged that, and they've been trying to come up with a plan to update their options to bring more students back on campus. That said, pre-pandemic, the occupancy of our student housing was still very high. It was, in excess of 95% occupied for many years. So it wasn't as if students were no longer wanting to live on campus, but I think the growth that happened in the 2000s meant that without corresponding growth in on-campus housing opportunities, meant that the market took over and some of those students were going to live off campus.
I think you've got a few questions in the actual chat box.
Okay.
I don't know if you saw those, but
let me go to the chat box.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and ask one of them because I've been sort of keeping up with these. One of them is, what is the plan for Carolina Coffee Shop building? If you know what the plan for that is.
Mm-hmm. So I did mention a little bit about Porthole Alley, where the Carolina Coffee Shop exists, and we, in addition to that smaller scale project to put the visitor center in the building kind of opposite Carolina Coffee Shop, we have looked at a redevelopment opportunity there to take down two buildings and add an extension to that area that would house a lot more activity than can be accommodated today. Whether or not we can go through with that is up in the air right now, because I'll say that we only did a very preliminary study in that area. And that was right before the pandemic, and some of the financial issues that the university and our endowment have gone through in the last year plus have affected our sort of aspirations for projects such as that. So, but I will say, because perhaps the person that asked the question heard a little bit about Carolina Coffee Shop. I think it was in the news about a year and a half ago. That project, if it does go forward, we're going to preserve the building with the coffee shop, try to actually upgrade it, and we'd love for the coffee shop to remain in its current location. Obviously, that's would be up to the owners of the shop whether they wanted to stay there. But the building we did want to preserve and do some renovation to kind of help upgrade it to the current century in terms of things like building codes and bathrooms and accessibility and such. Do we have time for more questions?
I think we've got time to answer these last two. So one of them is about Teague. I'm not sure if you've addressed Teague. I've been watching the chat box and the Q&A as well.
Okay.
But
yeah. So Teague and Parker are two residence halls adjacent to one another off of Stadium Drive, or along Stadium Drive, I should say. Those were actually identified as the beginning of this 12-year housing plan. And we had an idea to replace those two buildings with a new apartment-style building right in the same footprint as those two buildings. It would be a wonderful new facility that we were imagining there. But again, Carolina Housing took a big hit financially over the past year. And so we've actually just begun some conversations about revisiting that plan given the new landscape. I mean, it's like many things that some people have discovered over the last 6 months or so, is that, you know, while the financial picture has changed, the needs haven't really changed. So, you know, the need for redevelopment in our housing has not really changed. The buildings have gotten just a year older. We didn't do renovations on those facilities, but some of the reserve funds that housing was holding on to for these projects evaporated. So we have to kind of revisit how to finance those. But Parker and Teague were identified as the beginning of a redevelopment opportunity.
Great. So I'm not sure if you can see this one, but it says, call me old-fashioned, but I've always questioned why the new architecture could not be colonial style to resemble the existing campus buildings instead of the concrete edifices that are occurring since I graduated in 1970.
Yeah, I think that's an important comment. And I think particularly coming from alumni of this generation, and it's true not just of Chapel Hill, but I've worked on other campuses around the country, and it's almost true everywhere. That period of the 60s and 70s was not a happy time for architecture on college campuses. Some of that had to do with the financial realities of that period, as well as some architectural thinking of that period. So they tend to be some of the least beloved buildings on campuses across the country. So, and I think that instilled in a lot of people the thought that, why don't we go back and build the way we used to build? I personally think that that's not the right way to think about it, that there are better ways that we can learn other lessons from what happened in the 60s and 70s and say, you know, those buildings were not terribly welcoming. They weren't flexible. They sort of fell out of favor quickly. And how can we, and they were done often on the cheap. So it shows what happens when, you know, the wrong investments are made. So my take on this is that Chapel Hill is and should be a forward-looking institution. It's one with a deep and rich history, much of which we're proud of, some of which is not something to be so prideful of, but that we are trying hard to acknowledge those aspects of our history. And I think together, working with that fabric, we can look towards the future. How can we do better? How can we be the best at what we do at Carolina? And so, in my opinion, again, I think architecturally we can seek to build with that idea in mind. It's a forward-looking with an acknowledgement of what we want to keep in our past. And sometimes that may be taking references from our colonial history, other times perhaps not. So.
All right. I think your final two questions, do you have time for two more?
Yeah, I see there's something about expectations of funding from the National Infrastructure Bill being discussed. Will it renew light rail plans? That's possible, but I think highly unlikely because there's already been a pivot towards this bus rapid transit, which many think are going to be much easier to implement. And there's already been investment in getting that started. So, you may well have heard about recent news, such as Apple company wanting to make a big investment in a new campus down in our region. And I think other companies are kind of following that with also wanting to locate either new or additional staff in our region. So it's going to make these regional transit issues even more important. And I think those transit opportunities that can be implemented quickly are going to rise to the top. And I think buses is going to be able to do that, and probably a greater capacity. The reality with light rail is it was still going to be limited in what it could do in terms of the numbers of people it would carry each day, whereas I think the bus concepts have greater opportunity to move more people around. So I'm going back up, looking. Do you see, Jennifer, one that I missed?
I think that's it in the chat box. So the final one then would be over in Q&A, which is the Lenoir Hall question.
Okay, after it was closed in '72, when did it reopen for student dining? Also, as part of Lenoir, still an art studio location. It's a good question about when it reopened. I do recall there was a large project in, I think, the late '90s. Now, I wasn't here during that time, but I've heard the stories that for 1 year there were large tents set up in Polk Place to accommodate student dining while Lenoir was renovated. And those stories came out a lot in the last year, because if you've been on campus recently, you've seen that we added several tents to accommodate students during the pandemic, and they'd have more space, and outdoor space in particular, which to study and meet. As for the art studio location, no, it's fully and completely dedicated to food service. So we use every inch of it and more for feeding our students and faculty and staff too. I've eaten there a few times, and I see other people who are not students.
I think that's it. So thank you so very much, Evan. Thank you once again to all of our fabulous alumni, friends, and guests who took some time out of their schedules to join us for this enlightening conversation. Feel free to follow up with us if you have any additional questions, maybe for Evan, or about any additional programs we have going on this week. We hope that everyone is signed up and ready to attend the mocktail cocktail session this afternoon at 5:30 if you are a member of one of the milestone classes. And certainly we're hopeful that all of you have 11:30 a.m. tomorrow Eastern Standard Time on your calendar for our virtual Old Students Club address, where Bill Ferris will be giving his chat on his latest book. So thank you once again for your attendance, and have a wonderful evening.